Real quick before we begin, this video is sponsored by Privacy. Are you using your credit and debit cards online? Fool! They could get stolen, costing you thousands of dollars. You should use Privacy. Privacy allows you to create virtual cards connected to your bank account, which you can assign specific uses and spending caps to prevent you from ever getting overcharged or scammed. So if you want to pay for Netflix, you create a card just for Netflix, which is only authorized to pay your monthly subscription to Netflix. No risk of it being stolen. And if you want $5 off said Netflix subscription, you can go to privacy.com/Cinero for $5 off your first purchase. So what are you waiting for? Protect your info with Privacy. Now, onto the show. Rest in peace, MCU Spider-Man. In case you've been living under a rock for the past few weeks, Sony has ended their deal with Marvel, allowing Spider-Man to be used in the MCU. Why? Well, in short, Disney said, "Give us more money," and Sony said, "No," and walked away. It's a financial decision that honestly makes sense for Sony. You see, Sony originally made the deal with Disney after The Amazing Spider-Man 2 grossed a disappointing $700 million at the box office. They came to the table and said, "Hey, we'll let you use the character in your movies and co-produce Spider-Man movies with you, but we get to keep most of the profits of the Spider-Man movies," and Disney was like, "Cool, that works for us," and the deal was made. But now, with the success of Endgame and Far From Home, Disney wanted a new deal. Disney wanted to receive 50% of the profits for Spider-Man movies, which honestly was a bad move. Because Sony still owns the rights to Spider-Man, and 50% of $1 billion is still less than 100% of 700,000. And Sony had just come off of huge successes with Venom and Into the Spider-Verse. So basically, there was no financial incentive for them to keep Tom Holland's Spider-Man a part of the MCU. Thanks to Marvel, it's already a successful franchise, and with Tom Holland front and center, the average moviegoer probably will not even realize it's not a part of the MCU anymore. In fact, it makes more sense for them as it'll allow them to potentially cross him over with Venom and their forthcoming Morbius movie. And this sucks. No more Spider-Man, the other Marvel movies, no more Marvel characters in Spider-Man movies. Happy won't be a presence in Spider-Man 3, so I guess it really was just a summer fling between him and Aunt May. I wonder what they'll call this third Spider-Man movie. Spider-Man Never Going Home Again, maybe? It's very disappointing that corporate machinations have gotten in the way of a fully united MCU. And I hate that we're not gonna see Spider-Man in that universe anymore. But even with my disappointment, I can't help but wonder if there might be a silver lining in all this. Is Spider-Man better off without the MCU? Let me explain. I love the MCU. I really, really do. The amazing shared universe that they have managed to craft is astounding, but it's always felt a little limiting to me, and to a lot of people. Every Marvel movie feels a little homogenized. Like, instead of these being a bunch of independent films that coexist in the same universe, every movie instead feels like just another episode of the MCU TV show. For example, think back to how Edgar Wright was pushed out of his Ant-Man movie because it didn't really fit the Marvel mold. Or compare the first Iron Man movie to literally any other Marvel movie. It feels different, its own thing. It has its own cast of characters, conflicts, character arcs, and it doesn't feel like a part of a larger whole. It just feels like it's trying to tell one story. The story of Tony Stark redeeming himself and becoming a good man. As the Marvel movies went forward, however, every movie felt a little shallower. Less focused on telling its own story and more focused on leading into the next one. A lot of MCU films failed to develop their own distinct personalities, serving only the larger goal of the shared universe. Captain Marvel was a good example of this. It feels less like they're trying to delve into Carol Danvers' character and more like it's just a series of set pieces meant to set up a cool character who will be important in Avengers Endgame. We don't really stop to delve into who characters are, their emotional cores, their feelings, their motivations. Too often, Marvel characters can just become vehicles for the plot as opposed to characters moving the plot forward through their emotional journey. And again, I love the MCU. This is just an issue that arises when you try to have a shared universe. It's hard to let each individual film form its own personality and identity when it's supposed to fit in with a larger puzzle. And honestly, they've been doing a lot better with this in recent years. But there will always be limitations that come with being a part of the MCU. An MCU film will always be an MCU film first, its own movie second. The MCU Spider-Man movies did an okay job trying to avoid this trap. Both Homecoming and Far From Home have great casts of characters and do an admirable job of giving Peter actual character arcs in both films. But they also felt a little chained to the MCU. The first movie is all about him wanting to be an Avenger and being mentored by Tony Stark. Peter decides that he doesn't want to be an Avenger, but then, surprise, he becomes an Avenger in Infinity War because that's what needed to happen in that movie. The second movie is him dealing with Tony's legacy and, ironically, trying to escape the bigger concerns of the larger universe. Everything that happens in these Spider-Man movies happens because of what happened in other movies. You can't just sit down and watch them independently as Spider-Man movies. As much as I love Homecoming and Far From Home, when compared to something like Into the Spider-Verse, I'm struck by just how un-Spider-Man they can feel at times. I'm not saying they never feel like Spider-Man movies, but more time is devoted to the larger story of the MCU than Peter's relationships and personal struggles. Actually, I felt Far From Home was a huge improvement in this regard, but I still felt like the movies in the Sam Raimi trilogy, Into the Spider-Verse, and heck, even the PS4 Spider-Man game did a much better job of fleshing out Spider-Man's worlds and his struggles trying to balance his life with being Spider-Man. Like, how many scenes in Raimi's Spider-Man are just devoted with him trying to deal with his boss? And how many scenes does the MCU have that feels like these scenes with J. Jonah Jameson?
Boss, your wife's on the line. She says she lost a checkbook.
Thanks for the good news.
These movies have their own personalities, their own heart, and they do a much better job of exploring Peter, his relationship with his alter ego, his aunt, his employers, his love interests, and his friends. Again, for the 15th time, the MCU Spider-Man movies do a good job of this, and I love the MCU. But watching his non-MCU movies, I can't help but feel they could do much better. So, in this way, Tom Holland leaving the MCU could be a good thing. Director John Watts and his writers are coming back, so conceivably, this could be an opportunity for them to take the training wheels off and do something really interesting with the characters. They no longer have to worry about the MCU and its greater needs. They can just focus on creating the best possible story for Spider-Man and his friends. We can focus on Peter's struggles to balance being Spider-Man with his dreams and his family and his home and his school and his love life. Because that's what Spider-Man is. He's a normal guy who's late to work all the time because of extenuating circumstances. He's the guy who loves his aunt and tries to provide for her even when he can't afford rent. He's the guy who just wants to be with the girl he likes, but he's afraid he'll put her in danger. He's all of us, and I want to see the Spider-Man movies really get back to exploring that. Plus, there would never be a better time for this to happen. With Endgame wrapping the MCU up as we currently know it, it makes sense for Spider-Man to go off on his own adventures, free from the influences of Iron Man or other MCU players. And there's no big crossover films he'd really be needed for anytime in the near future. So long as they don't pretend like the previous movies didn't happen, I feel like future Spider-Man movies could feel like they're still connected to the MCU, just without any further crossovers. There's no need for there to be a bizarre, dramatic shift away from what had been done previously. This should, in theory, allow the filmmakers to organically take the MCU character further along the paths he was already on, just now with less constraints. If Sony leaves them alone and lets them do their own thing, I feel we're gonna get plenty of amazing Spider-Man movies with Tom Holland in the lead role coming down the pipe with no drastic changes to what we already know and love. Now, of course, that's the danger. Sony could screw this all up. They have notoriously micromanaged Spider-Man before to utterly disastrous results. And just last year with Venom, we saw they still have no problem churning out soulless cash grabs. But we also received Into the Spider-Verse from them in the same year, a real piece of art that captured the spirit of Spider-Man better than almost any other Spider-Man movie ever has. There, we see creators given the freedom to elevate Spider-Man to a new level, to create something more than just another entry in a franchise. With Into the Spider-Verse, we received not just a great Spider-Man movie, but a great movie with a great story. And my hope and prayer is that Sony learned their lesson from this film and give Jon Watts and his team the freedom to take their franchise and use it as an opportunity to make another great movie.